more stumbling blocks to so convince an international audience. Okay, now let me then go on to the second model, which is that of decolonization. While the law regarding belligerent occupation is founded on the principle of the sovereignty or independence of states, the two legal regimes developed at the UN regarding redress for colonized peoples and later for indigenous peoples share two key features in common. Both are founded on what is now considered an exalted or jus cogens, which means unbreachable, essentially, norm of international law, the right of self-determination of peoples, whose history merits a brief review. World War I was not in reality a world war. It was a Western war in which the Allied Western powers were pitted against two large multi-ethnic empires that then ruled Central and Southeastern Europe, respectively, Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. The Allies were significantly aided in their eventual victory by the fact that a zealous nationalistic faith, first synthesized in the French Revolution, was then sweeping minority enclaves in these empires and energizing the minority peoples therein to throw off oppression. Thus, at the end of the war, the USSR's Vladimir Ilyich Lenin and the US's Woodrow Wilson both sought to channel that fervor, that nationalistic fervor that was out there, to their own political goals. They did so by announcing that the new international society that would emerge from the war must now reorder the world in such a manner that it is consistent with the principle of the self-determination of peoples. I'm telling you this to give you to impress with you the rich, familiar and persuasive narrative of self-determination, which is at the root of the decolonization process. If you use this one, my view is that the international community says, oh, we know that one, yes, it rings true, of course we'll help. This is what I think, the pros for this particular model would be. Now, the Western powers were, in fact, hypocritical because the League of Nations extended the principle of self-determination to minorities in Europe that were formerly ruled by the defeated empires of Austro-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. They, however, refused to extend that principle to dismember the Afro-Asian colonies of the victorious powers. Okay, so it was a very, very selective application of the principle at that time. Note that it was not applied first and foremost to colonized peoples. It was, in fact, applied to European peoples and minorities under the subjugation of certain states. Thus, the Leninist view, which in fact privileged the self-determination of colonized peoples, would have to wait for 30 more years for a new agency, the United Nations, to carry out its vision. And that vision was that of decolonization. All right, the 1945 UN Charter, which legally binds all states, refers twice to the principle of the self-determination of peoples. The term right of self-determination does not appear in the Charter because the Charter was still, at the time of its construction, largely reflected the wishes of the Western powers, including France, England, and the US. These were the 5 biggies, although China and the USSR were allowed a seat at the table. However, even though the word right of self-determination doesn't appear in the Charter itself, the subject of colonies was in the Charter and treated in a bifurcate manner in Chapter 11 and Chapter 12 and 13. Chapter 11 created a regime for non-self-governing territories, which is a code word for those colonies that belonged or that were ruled by the Western victorious powers of the war. Chapter 12 and 13 created a trusteeship system into which peoples who had been ruled by the defeated powers of Germany and Japan were put. And the system of the two were quite different. The word independence does not appear in Chapter 11 for the colonies of the Western powers. The word independence does appear in Chapter 12 for the colonies of the defeated German and Japanese states. So the hypocrisy is right there. Moreover, a mechanism was created in order to oversee the move towards independence of the former Japanese and German colonies, and no mechanism whatsoever was set up to oversee not the independence of the Western colonies, but their advancement towards self-government. And so you must know that the word self-government does not mean independence in international law. And this is important as you look at the Akaka Bill, which doesn't even use the word self-government. It uses the word self-governance, which is like aspects of self-government. That's totally different from independence. However, things didn't stay that way, because as more and more Asian and African states joined the United Nations, in the General Assembly, there was a furor that developed over this bifurcate treatment of the two types of colonies. And the African and Asian countries all banded together and joined with the Soviet socialist states, the USSR and other communist states, to push for the right to independence of all non-self-governing peoples. And the General Assembly set up 3 different committees which would oversee this move, and you could study that and see whether you wish to bring your case to 1, 2, or all 3 of those committees. So now I will, because of lack of time, I will skip a number of important points that I would have liked to have said, but go straight to indigenization and why that's important. If you were to decolonize, or if you were to recapture the independence of the Hawaiian state via deoccupation, if you were to recapture independent statehood, either via the deoccupation model or the decolonization one, that alone does not assure that protection for the particular culture of the peoples indigenous to this archipelago would be safeguarded, number one. I think that's very important, because indigenization is not only a question of blood, and perhaps not even much of that, as Soli has pointed out. It's a question of, does the ethos and culture and history and memory of the Kanaka Maoli, here, which is unique, as all cultures are. And this is the only place where that culture has its home. Regardless of statehood and independence and all that, ought that in itself not receive maximal respect, honor, and protection? And in my view, the question is clear, but of course. And this is, in fact, what informs the indigenous movement at the UN. And it does not depend on whether you get independence or not. I personally strongly believe that the protection and the advancement, the ongoing evolvement and growth of any culture is important, and that it is much more likely that that could happen to Kanaka Maoli culture in an independent Hawaii than in a colonized or occupied Hawaii. I mean, I have no doubt about that. However, you don't have to wait for that to immediately start asserting international law protection for indigenous culture here. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples already gives you that power. And it seems to me that that's something that the movement should consider. Immediately start invoking some key principles of that declaration in your land struggles. One of the most important rights inscribed in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is that the state may not do anything in the territory of indigenous peoples that without their free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous people. That is unbelievably powerful. It basically gives, right, a veto power, and it's territoriality without statehood. But you can pursue statehood at one level and immediately start invoking protection for lands and territories that are traditionally Hawaiian. And another reason why that should be seriously considered is because I understand that the Obama administration has declared that it will reverse the Bush administration position and go ahead and sign on to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But you don't even have to wait, because go on the offensive. We want that protection. It is very important. It is one form of redress, not a sufficient one for the overthrow of an independent state. But there's no reason to do nothing until you do everything. Start immediately with what's already available. Okay, fine, and I'm sure. Okay, I'm sure I've gone way beyond. So those are the bare bones of the three approaches.